The shift did not announce itself with sirens or speeches. It arrived the way the most dangerous changes always do, quietly, in early 2026, while cameras focused on staged summits and recycled talking points. Something far more consequential unfolded beneath the surface of Europe's political machinery. There was no treaty signed in public view, no flag lowered, no dramatic resignation. Just a recalibration of power so subtle that Brussels noticed it only after the balance had already tipped. The moment came in Rome, not as a confrontation, but as a convergence. Two leaders standing side by side, not to challenge the European Union outright, but to expose its fragility by refusing to play their assigned roles. The old order depended on noise. Protests, votes, outrage, crisis meetings. Instead, it was met with stillness. And in that stillness, authority drained away. For decades, the European project operated on an unspoken assumption that sovereignty was negotiable, that national priorities could be postponed, overridden, or reshaped by committees far removed from the streets where consequences are actually felt. This assumption survived financial crises, migration waves, and even Brexit. But it could not survive realism, and realism returned to Europe with a vengeance. What made this moment terrifying for Brussels was not defiance from the margins. It was defiance from the core. A founding nation, an industrial heavyweight, a country too large to isolate and too central to punish, quietly stopped asking for permission. And when it did, others took notes. Hungary had long been treated as an anomaly, a stubborn outlier, a problem to be managed through fines, frozen funds, and moral lectures. But anomalies only remain anomalies until they find allies. When alignment replaced isolation, the entire enforcement model collapsed. The system was never built to discipline coalitions. It was designed to shame individuals. Behind closed doors, the realization spread fast. This was not about elections or ideology. It was about survival, about energy grids that must stay online, factories that cannot pause for virtue, families that cannot heat their homes with policy papers. The language of Brussels had become abstract. The language of Rome and Budapest was painfully concrete. The first fracture appeared in energy. For years, the continent had been governed by deadlines that ignored geography and arithmetic, targets set without infrastructure, promises made without supply. Leaders applauded each other for commitments that transferred costs downward while applause travelled upward. It worked until winter arrived, until bills doubled, until industries began to vanish quietly into bankruptcy filings. One government refused to participate in the illusion. It kept pipelines open while others delivered speeches. It read balance sheets while others cited values. And instead of collapsing under pressure, it endured. That endurance was the most dangerous example imaginable. The second government watched carefully. It saw what happened when reality was chosen over ritual. It understood that obedience no longer guaranteed stability. Only leverage did. And leverage came from controlling essentials. Power, money, decisions. The rebellion was never declared because declarations can be crushed. It was implemented. Ministries adjusted policies, budgets were shielded, negotiations stalled without drama, requests were answered with procedure instead of compliance. The machine slowed down, then began to jam. Brussels responded the only way it knew how, with warnings, with financial pressure, with moral condemnation delivered in carefully crafted statements. But something had changed. The fear was gone. When punishment no longer works, authority evaporates. Money became the next battlefield. Vast sums proposed in distant rooms, justified by urgency and wrapped in language designed to discourage scrutiny. The numbers were so large they ceased to feel real. Hundreds of billions committed not through direct consent, but through mechanisms designed to bypass resistance. Debt layered onto debt, sold as necessity. This time, the answer was not silence, it was refusal. Calm, procedural, unyielding, a simple message delivered without theatrics. National budgets are not blank checks. Solidarity cannot be enforced at gunpoint, and unity purchased through coercion is not unity at all. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Dissent was labelled sabotage. Prudence was framed as extremism. Questioning was treated as betrayal. In that moment, the mask slipped. What claimed to be a union of equals exposed itself as a hierarchy intolerant of deviation, and yet the resistance held, not because it was loud, but because it was methodical. Legal challenges replaced slogans. Delays replaced protests. The architecture of compliance was turned against itself. Every rule was followed just enough to prevent retaliation, but never enough to restore control. Across Europe, leaders watched closely. Not all agreed. Many were afraid, but they understood what they were seeing. The center was no longer holding, and for the first time in decades, the future was being shaped outside the glass towers. By the time Brussels grasped the scale of the shift, the narrative had already escaped its control. This was no longer about two countries. It was about whether Europe would be governed by people who face consequences or by systems that never do. And the most unsettling part was yet to come. The final transformation did not originate in Europe at all. It came from beyond the Atlantic, carried not by speeches, but by calculations. In late 2025, a series of quiet communications began circulating through diplomatic back channels. They did not praise consensus. They did not reference shared values. They spoke only of alignment, leverage, and mutual interest. For a continent accustomed to moral language, the shift was jarring. The message was unmistakable. The era of automatic partnership with supranational bureaucracies was ending. What mattered now was capacity, independence, the ability to act without waiting for permission from 40 rooms and 50 signatures. The global environment had hardened, and alliances were being reassessed accordingly. When Washington's posture changed, the shockwaves were immediate. For years, Brussels had positioned itself as the unavoidable intermediary between Europe and the world. Access flowed through it. Approval flowed through it. Punishment followed those who stepped outside its orbit. That assumption collapsed the moment alternative channels opened. Discussions that once would have been unthinkable suddenly became plausible. Direct economic coordination, security dialogue without institutional filters, financial backstops designed not to enforce obedience, but to reward resilience. For leaders already at odds with Brussels, this was not a provocation, it was validation. The old power centers struggled to respond. Germany, once the economic engine of the continent, was trapped in paralysis. Its industrial base strained under energy constraints. It could not reverse without admitting error. France, long the political conscience of Europe, faced internal fractures that drained its authority abroad. The motor that once drove the Union forward now sputtered unevenly, incapable of setting direction. Into this vacuum stepped a different model of leadership, one stripped of idealism, one focused not on symbolism but on durability. The new axis did not seek applause. It sought control over outcomes. It measured success not in declarations, but in whether factories stayed open and borders remained governable. This was the fundamental miscalculation of the old guard. They believed resistance would remain isolated, that fear would prevent alignment, that economic pressure would break dissenters one by one. Instead, pressure forged bonds, and bonds reshaped the map. What emerged was not a new bloc in name, but a coalition in practice. Coordination without charters. Influence without titles. Power exercised quietly where it mattered most. Energy corridors adjusted. Voting patterns synchronized. Negotiations delayed or accelerated with surgical precision. The genius of the strategy lay in its restraint. There were no grand announcements, no exit threats, no dramatic ultimatums. Those had already proven ineffective elsewhere. Instead, the system was hollowed out from within. Its rules obeyed just enough to render retaliation legally impossible, its authority questioned without ever being directly challenged. For Brussels, this was a nightmare scenario. You cannot sanction compliance. You cannot punish patience. You cannot rally against silence. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. The European Union was no longer the unquestioned center of gravity. It had become one actor among many. And worse, it was increasingly reactive, issuing statements after decisions had already been made elsewhere. The language of inevitability began to change. Where once leaders spoke of the European way, they now spoke of national exemptions, special arrangements, temporary measures that somehow never expired. Each concession weakened the structure further. Each exception became precedent. What had begun as a survival strategy was now a blueprint. A demonstration that sovereignty had not vanished, only been suppressed. That states still possessed leverage if they were willing to endure discomfort long enough to reclaim it. This was not a repeat of past ruptures. There was no referendum, No withdrawal clause invoked, no visible breaking point. The building still stood, the flags still flew, but the doors no longer opened the same way. Control had shifted from those who wrote the rules to those who understood how to live without them. The most unsettling truth for Europe's architects was that this transformation did not require mass movements or ideological revolutions. It required competence, discipline, and leaders willing to absorb criticism in exchange for autonomy. As 2026 advanced, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Decisions once coordinated centrally now required negotiation. Timelines slipped, enforcement weakened, and behind every delay was the unspoken acknowledgement that authority must now be earned, not assumed. This was the silent revolution, not a collapse, but an extraction, not destruction, but displacement. Power moved away from the abstract and back toward the tangible, toward energy, finance, borders, and law. The locks had not been broken. They had been changed, and by the time the old guard realized they no longer held the keys, the future of Europe was already being decided elsewhere.